It views conversion as a dynamic, asymmetrical word formation process. Dynamic in the sense that there is a base and there is a derivative. Asymmetrical because there is a dependency on the part of the derivative on the base, and a word formation process in the sense that it is not viewed as, for example, word class under specification, which is a different approach to the same evidence. We could also call it zero derivation, and the term will occur every now and then during the presentation, but I tend to view it as a separate word formation process aside from standard affixation. The literature establishes two conditions for conversion to occur, and they were defined most clearly by Jean Tournier in 1985. They are word class change and formal identity. On paper, they seem to be very simple conditions, but in a paper published in 2014, I complained how difficult it is to find a standard application of these two conditions. In the case of word class change, because the limits between word classes are extremely difficult to decide in some cases. They are blurred. They have many different types of exceptions. They also depend on whether you allow a central membership within the word class and peripheral membership within the word class or not. In the case of the degrees of identity, both intra and interlinguistic, because formal identity may be interpreted as a case of conversion or, for example, not. This is the case of internal modification. For the cases where, as in some examples where there is stress shift, we have the same orthographical form but not the same phonological form. Some authors consider this is conversion. Some authors, like Andrew Castells McCarthy, consider it is not. It is called internal modification. So the degrees of identity also vary from author to author, intralinguistically, interlinguistically too, because we may be talking about word versus stem-based conversion. Different approaches to the same evidence are possible in the application of formal identity. All this leaving aside the fact that diachronic and synchronic evidence may signal conversion as different word formation processes or not. On paper, these two cases, telephone and love, are cited as cases of conversion, but the history behind them is so different and the processes that they went through are so different then that theoretically you could argue that they are not the same thing. This is also word-based conversion. This is stem-based conversion with a process of inflectional leveling over the centuries. It doesn't matter much to present-day speakers. It may have only theoretical importance, but the fact is that diachronic and synchronic evidence do not always accord on what is conversion and what is not. The first point I will be presenting is whether conversion is a cross-linguistic property or word formation process or not. There is this classic paper by Penanning in 1984 who mentioned or described conversion as a typical Indo-European property or potential for coining new words. And he also linked it up with how heavily inflected languages are. Penanning proposed that highly inflected languages do not use conversion, and conversion is limited or constrained to languages that are poorly inflected, for example, English. Also, from a different theoretical point of view, natural morphology expected or should expect actually ranks conversion relatively low compared with other word formation processes. Unlike affixation, unlike compounding, conversion is non-iconic. It is non-iconic because it doesn't change the form as the meaning changes. And still conversion, which is non-iconic, seems to have a large potential for use. apparently for its economy of use, apparently also for its semantic versatility, which compensate the lack of morphological transparency. So in two papers that I will be presenting here whenever I am referring to this evidence, in two papers we sampled a set of Indo-European languages trying to find out how widespread conversion is. And what we found in these two papers is that conversion was recorded in 39 out of 40 Indo-European languages, except Mongolian, where the evidence was unclear. Now, the reason why conversion was reported by native morphologists in all those languages, I believe, is because conversion was interpreted differently by every one of them. And the two conditions set by Tournier, word-class change and formal identity, lend themselves to four different interpretations. Well, all four different interpretations occurred in the sample of Indo-European languages. We had languages where conversion is interpreted as word-class change and formal identity, for example, in English. But we also had cases reported as conversion where there is no formal identity. I mentioned these examples for English, where there is stress shift. Some authors, I said, describe this as internal modification, Andrew Castells-McCarthy, 2006. Some authors include under conversion also cases of voicing, vowel reduction in English. This does not only happen in English, it happens in other languages too. I don't know a word of Slovene. I'm relying on native speakers' evidence, where there is stress shift, different word class, and this was presented as conversion. There may be other formal changes, and this is the range of formal changes that we found. All these cases were presented as instances of conversion in Greek, in Basque, in Danish, Frisian, voicing, as I said in English, and also in Italian and other highly inflected languages where we have inflection marking the word class. So all these cases that are in theory or involve in theory lack of formal identity are still interpreted as conversion. So in all these languages, conversion is reported because these formal changes do not matter much. The third possibility was there is no word class change, but there is formal identity. The possibility for conversion to occur without change of word class, as far as I know, was reported in the first case by this book, Semantics, by Geoffrey Leach, where he considered conversion cases where one and the same word changes from, for example, causative to anti-causative, nouns countable or uncountable, adjectives gradable or non-gradable. This view was raised again under the name type coercion in Bauer, Lieber and Plague's 2013 reference morphology manual. And it is again in some papers, for example, Akiko Nagano also discusses type coercion in relation with conversion, meaning conversion may apply within one and the same word class only at the secondary level. And then there is this very difficult case for me, because it is about Spanish, where conversion is reported when there is no word class change or even formal identity. So from naranja, we derive naranjo, this is the fruit, this is the tree, and this was reported as conversion again. Difficult to understand if it were not, because it is reported by Franz Reiner and explained by Franz Reiner, where this is presented as a case of conversion. So out of a sample of 40 languages, we obtain 4 different all possible different interpretations for conversion according to the conditions of word class change and formal identity. They share some common ground. There is some change. It may not be word class change. It may not be absolute identity. But the fact is that all these languages, all these morphologists reported conversion to occur in their languages. The first two cases are the most important cases in the sense that word class change plus formal identity, strictly speaking, is rare. It occurred in very few languages. Word class change without formal identity was widespread, but then this is probably the standard case of affixation. It is everywhere. And then no word class change but formal identity is systematically present in all those languages. Not always interpreted as conversion, but it can be reported. And the conclusion that we drew from these two papers was that conversion is very unevenly attested because it varies, or it may vary a lot, from one language to another, from different genera, from specific types, that is, according to which word classes are involved in the process, from specific, according to specific directions too, within these word classes, whether it is noun to verb, or verb to noun, adjective noun, noun adjective, according to the productivity that the process or the evidence signals, according to the theoretical standpoint, that is, whether this is interpreted as the existence of a zero affix, or this is just not a word formation process at all. This is just a matter of word class under specification, especially clearly in some languages. So what the conclusion that we drew here is that conversion is defined according to basic conditions, but the application of the conditions is very uneven. It may not be because they are wrongly applied. It may just be that different languages use conversion differently, or different word classes use conversion differently. So there are several different types of conversion, not just the canonical case of clear word class change versus 100% formal identity. The second, I will come back to this point later on. The second point I want to talk about here is the relation that exists between words derived by conversion, the base and the derivative. And this point was raised by this quotation that is in Bauer, Lever, and Plack, this reference manual I mentioned earlier on, where conversion is referred to some point on the scale between homonymy and polysemy. And the quotation is relevant because in the first case it questions whether there is a need to define a relation between a base and a derivative in the cases of conversion. And also whether there is a tradition for describing this link between the base and the derivative. And here I'm talking about the relation between the words, not the process that moves the base to the derivative from one word class to a separate word class. Well, yes, there is a tradition describing the relation between words formed by conversion. And the tradition is within the paradigmatic lexical relations, specifically where the focus is on the form. It is also possible to find in the literature conversion-related pairs referred back to paradigmatic lexical relations with a focus on the meaning. We will be reviewing all of them now. This is the set of paradigmatic relations that have been cited in the literature for conversion, starting with homonymy. Homonymy is a classic here. Many references refer conversion back to homonymy, not as the quotation by Bauer, Lever, and Plack, but very clearly as a case of homonymy, a different type of homonymy. Some other references talk about heterosemy, which for me was a very difficult term to handle because in the literature it is cited only in 5, 6 references, and these very few references are mostly by person back in the 70s, and then reinterpreted by Lichtenberg in the 90s. So there are different views of what heterosemy is. The views do not accord. It is difficult to tell whether heterosemy has been defined and used by morphologists or by lexical semanticists for the description of words related by conversion. Also, in the case of heterosemy, most of the examples cited in the literature are about cases of grammaticalization. Grammaticalization has similarities with conversion. It is not the same thing. The similarities are formal identity, word class change, but the type of word class change is very limited. Semantically, and also concerning the word classes that are involved in grammaticalization. Then there is the term homomorphy, which was, as far as I know, coined in this manual by Quirk, Greenbaum, Leach, and Svalvik. Interestingly, homomorphy is presented along with homonymy and also with other cases of formal identity or formal contrast, like, for example, synonyms, antonyms. But I haven't been able to find homomorphy in the literature ever since. Nobody refers back to homomorphy except myself. But for some reason, the term didn't catch on. I don't know why. Homomorphy, sorry. Yes. Yes, exactly. So Quirk, Greenbaum, Leach, and Svalvik proposed the term. For me, it makes perfect sense, but then nobody seems to be using it.
It is used in Czech.
It is used in Czech. You see? But then this is my ignorance of some sources. Sorry about that. Last, zero derivation. Zero derivation, but viewed as a relation, not as a process. There is the process, zero derivation, or zero affixation. In this classic paper by Sanders, Sanders mentions or uses zero derivation as a term for the relation between these words. And then paradigmatic relations, where the focus is on the semantic contrast. Some references cite polysemy for these cases of conversion-related pairs. And then there is all the group of lexical extension by metaphor, by metonymy, and then also by less frequently cited terms, for example, synthemy or transcategorial hyponymy, which in the literature, it seems to me, have been used for roughly the same cases. Again, different interpretations are available, and again, the clearest cases that are argued for synthemy and transcategorial hyponymy are cases of what we call secondary word class conversion. That is, conversion not between word classes, but between secondary word classes, as Leach proposed in 1974. So this is again controversial in the sense that that type of conversion, secondary word class conversion, is not always accepted as such. Following the references by Miloš Dokulil, who placed conversion, and I'm using his words, at the crossroads of morphology, syntax, and semantics, I tried to find a description of the relation between conversion-related pairs outside lexical paradigmatic relations. I only found one reference, paronymy. Paronymic relations, as described by Cruz, refer to or include under themselves cases of conversion, for example, hammer and hammer, also cases that are not conversion. This book by Cruz refers to the cases of conversion as zero-derived paronyms. So this is the only reference where we move aside from paradigmatic lexical relations, which I think is important because in the case of conversion, we are not only talking about formal identity and semantic similarity or dissimilarity, we are also talking about the grammatical component that is involved in the word class change. And paradigmatic lexical relations do not always account for that. Actually, the scale, if there is a scale between homonymy and polysemy, doesn't use word class on the scale. It uses formal identity and then meaning relatedness, but there is no explicit mention of word class change along the description of that scale. This is a summary. This is a summary of the relations or the concepts that have been put forward to describe cases of conversion. So we have homonymy, we have heteronomy, but as I said, this is specific for grammaticalization. All the examples that are cited here are specifically cases of grammaticalization. We have homomorphy, but then homomorphy may also apply in any case of affixation. When we have, act, actor, it can also be said that there is a relationship of homomorphy. So it is not specific for conversion. Then we have polysemy, lexical extension, synsemy, hyponymy, and then zero-derived paronymy. And the minuses and the pluses are intended to show what occurs and what doesn't occur in these relations according to formal identity, morphological relation, word-class contrast, the semantic link between the base and the derivative, and then whether there is an etymological relation between base and derivative or not. We put all this together, and what seems to me is that the best terms for this description are heteronomy, except it has been interpreted in many different ways, or in several different ways in the literature. So, and also the examples refer to cases of grammaticalization. I'm not sure if this is meant for conversion. Zero derivation, and the problem here is that zero derivation is typically viewed as a process, not as a relation. That aside, this is a good description of what happens. Or zero-derived paronymy. But no paper refers to paronymy in relation to conversion specifically. So what's the conclusion here? Well, probably the conclusion is, as I said at the beginning, do we need a relation to link up or to explain base and derivative in conversion? I don't think we have the need. If we have the need, we, I think, should find the answer outside paradigmatic relations, because paradigmatic relations, lexical relations, do not refer to word class change. But that's all I can say here. I don't even know this is relevant at all. This is a paper submission with a promising set of 2 reviews. The paper just discusses this, presents the range of interpretations, and then argues for relations for conversion. I should also be adding that because conversion is so diverse, what happens here is probably we do not have only one type of relation for cases that can be described as conversion. We may have the conversion that happens between verbs and nouns, or nouns and verbs, or the conversion that happens between other word classes and their specific relations between those terms. The third point I want to mention today is the semantic categories that are expressed in conversion. And again, this is triggered by this quotation, an old quotation by Henry Sweet, where he contradicts himself by saying that conversion doesn't involve alteration in the meaning, and yet there is divergence in meaning, which is very telling of what happens in the description of the semantic change in conversion. Is there any such change? Well, according to the literature, there is conceptual recategorization, in the words of Paweł Stykała, addition of semantic features by Peter Akema, contrast in categorical meaning. This is probably what for me represents best what happens in the case of conversion. In pairs related by conversion, the lexical meaning of, for example, two items is the same. What changes is the categorical meaning, the meaning that the word has by virtue of being a noun or being a verb. And this is what changes in conversion, not any other item within the lexical identity of the base form. So, for example, in holster, the noun and the verb change in their categorical meanings, but everything else is probably the same. This is the basic semantic change in conversion. Of course, there are cases where what we have is figurative extension of meaning, and there is a range of patterns here. Figurative extension in the case of conversion between noun and verb, which is what I will be presenting today, may simply not play any role, as in the case of brick. It doesn't play a role in the derivation of the converted verb. Or it may play a basic role in the derivation of the converted verb. In some cases, it's very difficult to tell. I mean, the root may have been like as in brick, where figurative extension doesn't play a role. The verb derives from the base noun, and the figurative extension comes later in the noun, so it doesn't play a role here. Or it may be as in hamstring, where we have the literal meaning, then the literal meaning develops the opposite word class or the counterpart word class as a verb, and then we have this figurative extension within the end word class. So several different patterns may be described in the description of the figurative extension of meaning in conversion, including one which I find very interesting. It is the case of coffee house, where there is no intervening figurative meaning in the base, or no intervening literal meaning in the derivative. Coffee house is just a coffee house. The verb to coffee house means to gossip. But there is no counterpart gossip as a noun, and there is no counterpart coffee house, meaning to go to a coffee house, as a verb. So it goes across the word classes without intervening literal or figurative extension of meaning in the opposite of classes. How many cases are there like this? Very few. Very few. I could only find some 5-10 cases in the list of noun-verb conversion in the OED. Is it worth recording? I don't know. But what matters here is that conversion, as evidenced by all these cases, at least as semantics is concerned, should be studied by senses. This was proposed by Franz Planck in a paper in 2010 about directionality. The proposal in the paper was there's no point in trying to establish the base and the derivative as entries, because different senses may be taking different directions in the production of conversion. So if we want, and this is his very sound proposal, if we want to establish a directionality, then we should go sense by sense in the base or in the hypothetical base and the hypothetical derivative, and then apply tests and see what happens. So this is what I did, or what I tried to do in the case of the first pattern in the basic semantic change in conversion, noun to verb. See whether the list of semantic patterns that have been well established in the literature for noun to verb conversion apply in a sample of examples taken from the British National Corpus, and see how representative this list is. This list is basically the same list that has repeated itself since Hans Martin. It is in all these references. There are additional semantic patterns here that are not always shared by the literature. They are mentioned here and there, specifically one by Ilse Carius in 1974. But the literature refers to verb-to-noun conversion in terms of these 10 patterns. And the questions here are, how relevant are these patterns? Are any of these patterns more or less relevant than the others? How do they arrange themselves in the case of polysemantic items? And then how fixed is this list? Because as I said, other categories have been proposed, but it is unclear how relevant they are. And second, as far as I know, there was no experimental research to tell how representative the list of 10 semantic patterns is for conversion. And I'm saying this because there are examples like this too that I will be showing later on again, where I find it difficult to relate these verbs converted from nouns where I'm using any of the patterns listed above. I will be showing this thing again to see how well these cases can be explained in terms of those 10 patterns. For this piece of research, I selected a stratified sample of lemmas that have been tagged both as noun and as verbs in the British National Corpus, and then I sampled I collected the same sample for similar instances produced by affixation, specifically by prefixation of em or en, and then suffixation by any of these affixes to form denominal verbs. The data were selected starting from a sequence of 4 or more characters, unless they were numbers, using this sample generator that is online, and I find extremely useful. You set the conditions to generate the sample. Out of the entire frequency list of the British National Corpus, it gives you the sample that then you can export and then use. The cases of affixation were extracted excluding, for example, specific symbols, but allowing different spellings. The cases of conversion were extracted using a Python code designed by a colleague of mine on all the entries listed as nouns and as verbs. I don't know whether you probably know a lot about this, but I don't know even what this is. I asked this colleague, can you please do this for me? And then she came up with this list. They came up with this list of nouns and verbs. The result is a sample obtained at an interval of some 50 entries, and also to obtain a 51 entry list counting from frequency 1 in the British National Corpus upwards. Counting from frequency 1 upwards because it ensures the representation of hapax legomena, which are supposed to be representative for productive patterns. So frequency 1 was important for this sample. I then went through each of the entries for identification of the semantic categories and identified which semantic categories were present for each of the lemmas based on the analysis of all the concordances. So for each of the entry, I analyzed each concordance, starting out with the Plague's list of 10 semantic patterns, relying on the definitions in the Oxford English Dictionary. Whenever I had doubts, I asked colleagues, do you think this is a case of no performative or ornative? Some cases are very unclear. It can be classified as either, doesn't make much difference. And also aiming at semantic categories. It doesn't matter, or for me it didn't matter whether a preposition was needed by a specific verb or not, as long as the semantic category of the base noun was the same. This is the sample. The sample for conversion for en prefixation, then ate suffixation, en suffixation, if-I suffixation, I's suffixation. And this is the number of entries, the number of concordances reviewed for each of them. Not always in the same range, but this is what I could find, because many of the cases sampled had to be replaced. The pink shade means that the original item that was sampled had to be replaced because it was irrelevant, or it occurred in the frequency list and not in the British National Corpus, or it was a totally different thing, or it was a typo. So the pink shade means the substitutes for irrelevant cases. We can see that conversion shows most pink, specifically in the case of the hapax legomena, because most of these were originally names, proper nouns that had to be replaced once and again and again and again, trying to reach a clear case of a denominal verb behaving as such in the British National Corpus. Even so, it was not always possible to find substitutes for the frequency ranges. Specifically in this part, we couldn't find any case of en suffixation that was a relevant case. And then we have also cases, as I mentioned, of mismatches between the frequency list and the actual evidence contained in the corpus. Maybe the frequency list says there are, 15 examples. In actual fact, all we have is 12. This is a graphic representation of the same thing. The sample, which should be a very smooth line down, but shows some steps here and there for the reasons I mentioned. The case that we are interested in, or most interested in, is the red line, which is conversion from frequency 960 down to frequency 1. And so, if we go back to the first question, what is the relevance of each of these patterns in conversion? I obtained these two charts when I considered the entries. So there seems to be patterns here, a relatively reasonable spread of these 10 semantic categories, with 2 relevant points here: no evidence for privative, and there's something missing there because it doesn't count up to 100% of the sample. The figures here are so low because the entries are 51. It doesn't matter much because, as I said, the approach that I'm using is an approach by senses because the entries may be polysemantic. So what matters is the same thing, not by entries but by senses within the entries, where the figures are more consistent. They still need statistical validation. I'm working on that, but the figures are relatively more solid. And what happens here when the representation is by senses is that the same happens here. The original representation of the privative semantic category is nothing, and we have many items out. There's still a long way until we reach 100% of the sample of converted nouns. How uneven is the distribution of these patterns that I present here by senses in the case of conversion compared with instances of standard affixation? These 5 charts represent conversion, en prefixation, and then 4 different types of affixation by aid, en, ifi, and eyes. I wonder if, I don't know, I tried to see a common line here. I wonder if you see any. I wonder if you could identify which the chart for conversion is, if you think one is very different from the others, or they all look the same to you.
It's not quite clear.
For me,
What I'm missing are the labels.
Oh, the labels, yeah. Well, actually, the labels are out there because I use this to see, am I just seeing things or are there actual differences? Because the labels, I tried not to represent the labels. I found that this chart is different from the rest of the charts in several senses. This is the chart for conversion. And the differences I found are that there is a similarity as regards the semantic category locative. So conversion represents locative patterns, same as en prefixation, and to a lesser degree also as eyes. And then that there are two semantic patterns that are represented in conversion, but are not very strongly represented in the rest of our fixation patterns. So performative is virtually missing throughout, and then instrumental is again virtually missing throughout. There is some here in the case of en prefixation, but otherwise we find very small values. And the second thing that I pointed out is, so how much of the semantic spread of conversion does this make? It makes 80%, roughly 80%, which is very low, particularly compared with the figures that we obtained for the rest of cases. Not any of them makes 100%. The remaining part is irrelevant cases, they are typos, they are items that have been tagged wrongly, but they never reach as low as 80%. In the case of conversion, 12% is irrelevant, unclear, or repeated hits. That is, hits that do not lend themselves to an analysis because they are just random sequences of letters that have been tagged as verbs, but they are not. But if we add 12% to 80%, we still have roughly 8% cases missing. 8% cases that are not represented by these semantic categories proposed in the tradition for denominal verb formation by conversion. So this prompts the question, if we have 8% missing, how fixed is the initial set of patterns? Does it need revision? Do we need more patterns to explain some cases? I will be showing here some cases that I believe are not represented by any of these semantic patterns. And because this is also a work in progress, I thank you if you could say, no, you are wrong. This is a clear case of don't know, vocative, onative, whatever. I'm citing here the definition of this verb in the OED. I'm showing the examples that prompted the occurrence of this item in my sample. In the case of Blair, I should also mention that this case is presented as the verbal nominalization. That is, the directionality of the process of conversion is the opposite. The OED does based on chronological records. The verb is first recorded in the late 14th century, and the noun is recorded in the 5 centuries later, or nearly, in the 19th century. But I should mention here also that directionality, according to earliest attestation dates, is for me an extra linguistic process. I think directionality should be established based on the criteria proposed by Hans Marchand in the 60s: semantic dependency, productivity, semantic range, items, criteria that are linguistic, not the extra linguistic evidence of a manuscript being available or not for the recording of this item in the Oxford English Dictionary. So that aside, and also allowing for the possibility that this may be a case of the verbal nominalization, I find it difficult to represent this and these examples within this. I don't know. And I genuinely thank you if you could say, no, this is a very clear of the performative pattern. We will come back to this example later on if you want, but I want to present a range of cases that are difficult for me to classify. This is another one. With no definition in the OED, it is not recorded in the OED, to kitten. So I find these examples in my sample, and I am supposed to explain the semantic change, the categorical contrast, the categorical meaning the contrast in the categorical meaning between noun and verb in terms of these categories, but I find it very difficult. If any, for the case of kitten, I don't know. I couldn't relate this to any of these patterns. So we have kitten. Sorry, we have Blair. We have kitten. We have receipt. Receipt, just to produce a receipt, to create a receipt. This could be performative. I think this could be performative. But I don't think it has the same profile as other cases of performative in the sample. We come back to any of these during the discussion if you find it relevant or not. I'll show some other cases that are difficult for me to classify. So we have Blair, we have kitten, we have receipt, we have nightclub, with some doubts on the word class identity of these examples, but recorded as a verb in the OED, to visit or go to a nightclub. Again, difficult for me to classify in terms of these semantic patterns. This is a silly example. Silly in the sense that silly. Difficult to handle because the source is a part of the BNC, that is miscellaneous sources, specifically, I don't remember, but it was very informal language. I was surprised to find here in the OED under these descriptions. I don't think this fits any of these definitions. I don't know. Only example of its kind, which is why I say it's silly. It is the only case where I find this don't know pattern. I don't know how you understand here as a verb here. Difficult. I'm leaving the most difficult examples for the end. To weather. When I saw weather in the sample, I was very happy. And then I found I just don't know what to do with weather. Last example. Foul, to catch, hand, shoot, or snare with foul. So it is this type of examples that make this 8% of cases that I couldn't represent in the chart because I couldn't associate or link up with any of the semantic categories that are listed here. I tried to supply some kind of don't know paraphrases, semantic pattern here. I think we could use the label effected as in semantic roles for semantic roles for syntactic analysis. Produce X, produce kittens, produce a receipt, produce a Blair. Makes sense to me. Directional, go to. There are other examples that are directional too. This is the silly example. Have. I don't know how much sense this makes. I couldn't produce any pattern for fall or for weather a storm, weather a crisis. I couldn't just produce any example. I'm very lost here. I tried to see if these possible patterns also occur outside conversion in the cases of affixation. This seems to be okay. This seems to be okay too. Go into a trench or go to a trench. This doesn't prove or disprove anything, but there seems to be similar examples with affixes, not only in conversion. And then the figures. The figures of these patterns are not very high. They make this 8% that was missing. So we had 80% represented by the semantic categories in the literature. Then we have 12% irrelevant cases, and then we have 8% that was missing. This is the 8% that was missing, which is there. How relevant these categories are? Well, some of these categories are a lot more frequent than others in the original list, specifically this one. These two cases that I classified as I don't know how to classify this, make a solid 4%. So there are quite a few patterns here that are waiting. And by contrast, some of the patterns that are represented in the description that we find in the papers are comparatively very low. Specifically, the privative pattern is just 0% in the sample. So how fixed is the initial set of patterns? Well, maybe we have room to propose a revision of this set of patterns. I don't think the result that I will be proposing is any better, but I think some of these cases are redundant. In all these cases, we have the noun as an attribute, whether it is resulting or it is current, in this case in causative structures, but the semantic role, the argument that the noun makes with respect to the noun is the same. It is an attribute, so there seems to be some overlapping here, or this seems to be relatively redundant. The same happens with some adverbial cases where we have space, either location or direction, but it is a relation of space. In the case of affected, it is more difficult. Yes, I think we could also find cases of overlap, but I find those too difficult to handle for a presentation. If we refer the original set of semantic categories plus the semantic categories that I proposed earlier on for those examples that couldn't be represented here, what we find is that we have an adverbial, we have an attribute, and we have some kind of direct object that may be, in semantic terms, affected, effected. It may be an event, an instrument, or a possessed item. The granularity of the classification may be very simple. 3 basic categories. The noun is an adverbial to the verb. It is an attribute to the verb, or it is a direct object to the verb, or it may be, in semantic terms, more complex if we refer that to specific types of adverbials: manner, space location, space direction, attribute, current or resulting, and then affected, effected, event, instrument, possessed, or who knows what out of these categories that are represented here by examples like to weather a storm, or to go, I'm going to fall in the morning next week. So to the last question, how fixed is the initial set of patterns? It doesn't seem to be as fixed as the literature seems to suggest. There is 88% of cases that is not represented there. does this proposal, and this is a very ambitious term for what I'm presenting here, it is not even a proposal, but does this representation of what happens in these semantic categories here have any advantage with respect to what is in the literature? Well, the advantage, the main advantage is that it avoids repetition of major types, attributes, adverbials, and also allows the explanation of more types. Specifically, these two types, and counting out the possessive, which is the example for hair. And again, I am not counting these examples, which I find difficult to describe. Well, a possible advantage is that it refers the role of the noun with respect to the categorical meaning of the verb to specific syntactic and semantic functions, which are easier to handle, or for me are easier to handle than a list of conceptual classes as listed here. And it has the potential to explain more cases. Which other cases? For example, the cases that I listed at the beginning and I didn't know how to classify. The example of envy. In the case of envy, I think this is just a direct object phenomenon, as in relational processes where the subject experiences a phenomenon, whether mentally or physically. So it has the potential to explain more cases. The disadvantages of this reinterpretation: it is not so transparent because it refers to syntactic categories, but mainly semantic categories that are not very widespread in the description of morphological processes. There is no tradition for this. I don't think this could lead anywhere for many cases. And the categories that we may be using are less fine-grained in this proposal than here. This is more fine-grained because, for example, what occurs here as a direct object and is just affected, well, this affected semantic role is more coarse-grained than, for example, considering privative or, performative or onative. So it is less fine-grained. Other disadvantages, I'm sure there are. This is not even a proposal. This is work in progress. Again, waiting for reviews, but no reviews in yet. I will let you know if you are interested in this thing. So these are some of the references that I used for the presentation. I will be happy to show them later on again if you would like to see about any of them. And thank you very much for your attention. I'm really looking forward to your feedback because as you noticed, I'm very lost here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There are a lot of ideas which are a kind of inspiration for further thought. So I hope that the discussion will be pretty rich. And first,
Can you hear me? Oh, it's because of the recording. Thank you very much. My problem is it's so diverse that I have just a couple of minor problems to point out, and some of them are even larger ones. Now, starting from the end, actually, that is the, let's say, a list of semantic categories. I think they can easily be amplified and just edit some. I would just like to see the causative being split into proper causative, that is those who relate to verbs, and factative, which are related to nouns or adjectives. And what I really do miss there is something which I would call utilization or making use of, which would refer to things like nightclub, that is basically making use of nightclub. And there are several more examples of this type which can fit in. Some of the cases could also be inchoative, but that is without context difficult to point out. And I think there are some more evidently used in the Czech description of this field of word formation. Let me mention a rather serious thing which somehow is traditional. Most linguists, including you, seem to be fixed on paper, on what is written on the white board, but simply forget the acoustic side of it. Things are sometimes pronounced a little bit differently, which is not reflected on the paper. This is the case of the Slovenian lepo, lepo. It's not only change of stress, but it's the change of intonation, and there is no way how to describe intonation in grammar descriptions. I would just very much advocate using this or taking it into consideration. A very common case, if you don't want to go to Slavic language, is Scandinavian languages. Swedish or Norwegian do have the same, even though there is only one tone which is relevant. Now, I think, since you mentioned it only in passing in the very beginning, that perhaps you should be more careful about. You mentioned the distinction, diachronic and synchronic. I think you should be more careful about where synchrony starts, because diachrony is somehow behind it, but not always, and a very distant diachrony is probably not taking part in this. It should be made more clear. And my last comment is, I'm no expert in this. I've just been busy with Czech word formation and being rather critical to Dokulil. I don't know how much you know him. He's a sort of grandfather or great father, both, in the Czech word formation, though I think he somehow doesn't like the term conversion, because, and this is one of my last examples, comments, because he doesn't use the term where some other authors would use it, like myself. He simply has different labels, several of them, which are conversions, but he names them in a different way. So up to you. If you want to spot where the term is used, you have to know the language in question, because not only a conversion, but some other labels I used here. And my very last comment is a thing which is very common, which is appalling actually in this kind of field, and that is you have never mentioned it or considered yourself, is that conversion concerns only what is sometimes called auto-semantic words, or as against synsemantic, or if you like, common or full grammar words. So if you take into consideration the English prepositions like for or as, they should not fix into your scheme, because this is never mentioned. These are not auto-semantic words, but they exist, and it's a very rich type of conversion, of course. Some people just try to avoid this, saying, oh, well, it's a change of function, but the function and conversion in this sense could be substitutes of each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's your word.
Yeah, absolutely relevant point. Very, very relevant point. Starting with the beginning, I do think that the sample doesn't represent all that is there, even if the cases studied make some 4,000 cases, going by census. It is not represented there. I'm mentioning this because, as you said, there must be other categories. This category, which was not represented, I'm sure it is there, only it didn't fall within the sample. So a bigger sample might evidence new things, new categories. Which categories? I don't know. This is difficult to predict. The second point you mentioned is, I think, it is synchrony versus diachrony. There's no way I can tell how to separate one or the other. What I do is I just go to a database, take everything that is annotated as the two classes, and don't go into diachronic considerations. I think there are substantial differences between those examples I mentioned, but I don't use them. I don't take them into account because I don't think a native speaker of English takes them into account. For a native speaker of English, telephone is the same case as love. They don't know anything about the history of English, how it developed, whether it is, don't know, word, stem based. For them, it is just a case of a noun and a verb, and they look the same, and I use them all the same. I used to think that was an important theoretical distinction, and at one point I remember considering differently telephone from love. But from the point of view of the processes, from the point of view of the theory, in terms of usage, I no longer think they are used different by people, or even viewed differently by native speakers. Thank you also for mentioning intonation, which I think is an important part here. The phonological representation of words, which is, I agree, the basic representation of words, not the written form, is completely ignored here. Actually, this distinction between conversion and internal modification, which Andrew Custis McCarthy proposed for the cases of stress shift in English, was for me very relevant. I wouldn't classify cases of stress shift along with conversion for the phonological change, and the proposal to treat them as a different word formation process, internal modification, as he called it, makes every sense to me. I just have the doubt whether it is still present. I wonder how productive it is. I don't remember where, but I remember getting the idea that this was a phonological change associated with deformations between the X century and the X century along the period of English. But it doesn't matter much.
I'm sorry, I have to just intrude. I think it is very productive somewhere. Not maybe so much in the European languages, even those Scandinavian ones which I mentioned do have it as a very productive feature, but take something which is outside the scope of Indo-European languages like Chinese. Mm-hmm. Conversion is so basic, it's a crucial point because there is basically no grammar, no word formation, that the sentence is based on conversion of the same morphemes which just change function. What is even more interesting than the cases I mentioned is the change of tones. Chinese has 4, in some cases 5 tones, and these just do project into the syntactic function of that particular form. It is extremely important, it is hardly ever mentioned, and it should be included.
Yeah, I agree there. I was referring to the stress shift in English. Specifically in English. I know it is productive and fully active and systematic in some languages. I don't know any Chinese. I know the case of Chinese. I know how much it may change the meaning. And yes, I agree, it should be represented there. For the case of English, I don't know. I don't know how productive it still is. I don't know that it is associated with a given period of time that is no longer influential today. So the pattern is dead. I don't know. But I know in other languages it is. In the case of Slovene, in the case of, as you said, Scandinavian languages, it should be taken into consideration for conversion all the way. Actually, I think it should exclude these cases from conversion because there is no formal identity at the phonological level. But the morphologists who are dealing with this don't seem to be doing so. And I agree with you there that this needs additional consideration. I may be missing any of your points, but I think the last one was about prepositions. Am I right?
Preposition and conjunctions.
Yes.
Or as in English.
Yes.
That is grammar words. Grammar words which are otherwise foreign
Yes, yes, yes. In the latter case, in the last part of the presentation, because I focused on one particular pair of word classes, nouns and verbs, but as you said, minor word classes in general are ignored here. They are not considered cases of conversion. In the literature, they are just left aside as nonce formations or very minor cases. How relevant it is? Very relevant, I think. But I have problems with the bigger types, meaning bigger, most frequent types. I don't know where to start with those. It would be very difficult to handle those. But thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Just a few small things. First, at the very beginning, you mentioned that Mongolian did not fit into the Indo. The problem might be that Mongolian is not an Indo-European language, you know.
I don't know there. I'm not a typologist. I know it was included in the sample designed for a different project. Mongolian was included within the set of Indo-European languages. I didn't question that.
Yeah. But the problem is that it's not, and that might explain it being exceptional, in fact. You know,
Thank you.
And then just a small, when you mentioned coffee house, in fact, and the special meaning, I think it's a nice example of metonymy, in fact. And metonymy, I suspect, is something which relates most of the categories, in fact, because you might say, what is the typical activity associated with X? And then you have brick. What is the typical activity associated with X? And you have actually building a wall. What is the typical activity associated with coffee house? What do we typically do with nightclubs? We go there, in fact. And so this might be an overarching, and the problem with metonymy, of course, is that it depends on the semantics of the noun, and it's also, I suspect, culturally conditioned, that you would do like dust being an example of privative. Dust and to dust, but in some cultures dust might be, I don't know, adored, you know, and in that case you would have a different pattern again. And of course metonymy is so variable that I would say nicely explains why you came across certain cases where in fact the relationship was so idiosyncratic because of the different metonymic relationship which the given culture was employing. So that was just
Thank you very much. Absolutely. Metonymy plays a basic role here, and it is also, I find it difficult to come to terms with whether it is a part of word formation or not. There seems to be a side here with morphologists who deny a place for metaphor or metonymy in word formation versus those that believe that yes, metonymy and word formation play a major role in the formation of new words. I think it is behind many of these cases, and as you said, metonymy explains, and also ever since René Diven in the late 80s, who proposed metonymy and cases of figurative extension, basically metaphor too. This thing can be explained in terms of some of them, but again, as you said, it is not as systematic as those semantic categories. So I wonder whether the metonymy that I could think for specific examples is language conditioned, as you said in my case or not. But absolutely, thank you very much for that.
Just very minor questions, two of them. I missed your introduction to the semantic categories, the 10 of them. They are proposed specifically for conversion, or the question is if they can apply noun to verb derivation in general, or if they are specifically for the conversion type.
No, they are general labels that are used for other cases. but they are listed as the range of semantic categories that are represented by conversion. So they occur outside conversion, but outside this, nothing has been proposed that I know.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is concerns the derivatives in your data sample, the verbs with the prefixes and suffixes. Were they had they the same meaning as the conversion verbs, or were they shifts? When you found the derivatives and the conversion verbs for the same base, what was the relation between them?
Not any. We just wanted examples that were within similar frequency ranges, and the examples that were formed by these web formation processes, starting with frequency 1 up to make 51 examples. I wonder how possible that, or I wonder how feasible it would be to conduct this thing if we kept the same basis, because even counting different bases, it was quite a big problem to obtain 51 cases at a reasonable, within reasonably comparable ranges of frequency. So using the same basis, very, very difficult. It would be very difficult. I think. I didn't try that. So. We took for granted we didn't find them, particularly within frequency 1. You could have found maybe random cases, but not many.
Thank you.
So, are there some more questions, remarks? Well, if not, so it's my pleasure again to thank you for coming to Prague and to accept our invitation. And I'm sure that there will be connections in the future with which we can profit on both sides, maybe. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.